Good afternoon. Is this mic working? Is the mic working? Sort of. No. Could someone check on the mic? I would continue, but we are being recorded and streamed, so I'm conscious that the mic really should work. Please continue talking. Otherwise it's going to get really very awkward. Okay. Are we good? Okay, great. I've got the thumbs up. So good afternoon. My name is Tom Glaisyer, and I'd like to welcome you to the New America Foundation to what will be a fascinating discussion about the current state of journalism in today's media landscape. I lead our work here on media policy as part of a team housed within New America's Open Technology Initiative. And for just under the past 2 years, we've been considering how the changing media and technological landscape affects citizens' participation in a democracy. We've used as a backdrop for our work the Knight Report on Sustaining Democracy in a Digital Age, a report that concluded that individuals need 3 things to participate in a democratic society: relevant and credible information, the education needed to engage with that information, and opportunities to participate in the public life of their community. How this will happen in the 21st century has spurred a vigorous debate and even the engagement of the FCC. Notably, it released a report on June 9th that focused on the changing media landscape in a broadband age. The report was long in the making and long in form. Its 468 pages have received a lot of media attention, and it makes our meeting and our event today very timely. Though our event today focused specifically on a book that brings together many of the most significant contributions to this debate about journalism in the future that come from many perspectives. The book and our event today have the same title, not particularly optimistic. Will the last reporter please turn out the lights? As the co-editors note in the first paragraph of the introduction, American journalism is in an existential crisis. And if that doesn't make you think this is serious, it goes on to state, it is impossible to conceive of effective governance and the rule of law, not to mention individual freedoms, social justice, and effective and enlightened solutions to daunting problems. Without a credible system of journalism, in short, just about everything rides on how the crisis in journalism plays out. These are the questions that form the backdrop for the book and our event today. The contributions the book contains come from a wide range of perspectives from journalists, scholars, and activists. To introduce us to the book, we've invited co-editor Victor Pickard, who's a research fellow with us and a professor at New York University, to share his thoughts on the book and what it covers. Subsequently, we will move to a roundtable discussion and be joined by 4 additional chapter authors. Nikki Usher, who I had written down here as a professor at George Washington University for several days, but actually she informs me she's not yet to start, so she's almost a professor at GW. Thomas Frank, a former Wall Street Journal journalist, author of What's the Matter with Kansas, an economist at Harper's Magazine. Jessica Clark, a journalist and also a fellow at the New America Foundation, as well as at the Center for Social Media at American University. And finally, Craig Aaron, a former editor and now the president and CEO of Free Press. I'm also very pleased to see some familiar faces in the audience, especially Professor Michael Della Carpini, Dean of the Annenberg School, and also a chapter author. Before I start, there's a little housekeeping. As I mentioned before, the event is live streamed and on the web, as well as being recorded for C-SPAN. Everything is on the record forever, or at least as long as C-SPAN, Google, or WikiLeaks can index it. For those of you on Twitter, please use the hashtag #NAFevent if you are watching remotely, and we normally have about twice the audience in the room watching remotely. Please use that event and we'll pick up your questions in the Q&A session at the end. If you do wish to ask a question in the final section of the event, please wait for the microphone. We need to respect the online audience and make sure they hear us too. So without further introduction, I would like to invite Victor Pickard to the podium to share some reflections as a co-editor. Victor, should we be as optimistic as your title suggests? Please. Thanks. Put your hands together.
Thanks, Tom. That's a great question, and I'm afraid my talk will be a little bit in keeping with the pessimism of the title, but then we'll rely on the panelists to bring it back up. It means a lot to me to be able to talk to you today at the New America Foundation. I haven't been here since the spring of 2009 when I was working here full-time as a research fellow. And when I reflect back on that period, I remember that there was something in the air at the time as we were moving in to these new offices. It wasn't just the fresh carpet smell, but there was a sense of optimism about the media policy reforms that were possible before us. And what was also interesting is that at this time there was a lot of talk about the future of journalism as a problem for public policy. And if you recall, in the spring of 2009, journalistic institutions seemed to be imploding. We had major papers like the Seattle Post-Intelligencer and the Rocky Mountain News going under. Jobs and revenue were in precipitous decline. But to use an old cliche, we also saw this, or at least certain circles here at New America and within DC, saw this crisis as an opportunity to explore structural alternatives to the commercial media model for establishing a public service model for journalism. And that was one of the original motives for this book that Bob McChesney and I co-edited. Now, a lot has changed in the last 2 years, but unfortunately the journalism crisis is still here. The hemorrhaging has slowed down, but the long-term view of these journalistic institutions remains bleak. And just to be clear, the conversation should never just be about newspapers, of course. It's about the future of journalism, but it is still with newspapers where most of our original reporting comes from. And it is the newspaper industry that is undergoing the greatest decline. According to the Pew Research Center, newspaper newsrooms are 30% smaller than they were in 2000. And there's little evidence that the advertising revenue that once supported these vanished jobs will ever return, but instead will continue to gradually fade away. So what this suggests is that the advertising-supported journalism, the model that has functioned for the past 125 years or so, has come apart. So what comes next? That's a core question in our book. And Bob McChesney and I and others had hoped for a transition to some kind of public subsidy model. But in a tragic irony, just as we see convincing evidence for the failures of commercial media all around us, we as a society are barely maintaining even the current meager levels of funding for public media. And what's worse is that many of the highly touted alternatives have not panned out. Specifically paywalls or online subscription models where readers pay for content, what some have likened to a Hail Mary pass for the newspaper industry. It may work for certain niche markets, but it doesn't seem to be a systemic fix. I recently watched the new documentary, Page One. Has anyone had a chance to see that yet? A few of you. I thought it was generally very well done, but I was struck by how much the New York Times journalists seem to be pinning their salvations on the success of paywalls. And this in despite of the fact that recent reports are showing that the revenue that's being generated by paywalls is not coming close to offsetting other losses. Now, other digital startups are emerging, but it's questionable as to how much news they're producing given the number of journalists they employ. To just give one example, I exchanged emails recently with Josh Marshall, who's the founder of Talking Points Memo. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with it. I'm a big fan. It's often trotted out as a exemplar for what the internet can produce in terms of news production. And I asked Josh how many journalists they were employing. I had always heard it was somewhere around 10. He told me that my information was dated. They're now employing 14. And they hope to expand to 17 very soon. So 17 journalists, on the surface, that sounds promising, but then if you juxtapose that with the thousands of journalist jobs that have been lost in just the last few years, it leads to a more sobering assessment. So I don't want to sound too pessimistic. There are reasons for hope. New experiments continue. and there does at least seem to be consensus that new journalistic models are required, but the consensus ends there. This crisis really is as much about how we think about journalism as it is about the journalism crisis itself. If you think of journalism primarily as a commodity, then its profitability dictates its existence. But if you think of it first and foremost as a public service or as a public good, then you recognize it must be sustained regardless of market support. And how we frame and understand the problem leads to different emphases and different approaches. Now, overall, there's been a compelling pluralism to these debates about the future of journalism, and a lot of assumptions are being challenged, new ideas advanced. That's why Bob McChesney and I put together this book with 32 essays on the future of journalism, which I'm just going to briefly discuss in my remaining time. We had three basic aims for The Last Reporter: to bring into focus the structural nature of the crisis, to organize the debate according to many of the major positions on the future of journalism, and to advance the discussion with fresh proposals. The book basically divides evenly between these three objectives. We reprinted some classic pieces from 2008 and 2009 to give a sense of the run-up to and the early stages of the crisis. We tried to capture some of the more innovative policy proposals for supporting journalism. This is something I hope we can get into more in the discussion. And we also have pieces that look at the implications of the changing media landscape, like Bruce Williams and the aforementioned Michael Delle-Carpini, who takes seriously this idea that people are increasingly getting their political information from fake news like The Daily Show, and that this raises troubling questions about accountability. There are a number of contributors to the book that look at what kinds of content are rushing into the void left by departing traditional journalists. We tried to fairly represent diverse views, many of which we did not agree with. We have David Simon advocating for paywalls. We have Yochai Benkler suggesting that networks and new media like WikiLeaks will organically produce an alternative if given time. And Matt Welch, the editor-in-chief of the Libertarian Reason magazine, suggests that the journalism crisis is written by its losers and that people like us are being overly alarmist. So we deliberately sought views that did not necessarily correspond with our own. Yet, like many books, we saw this as a vehicle to intervene in policy debates, and we make clear that we come down in support of public subsidies for sustaining experimental and independent media. Another aim of the book was to remind people that our current media policies are not inevitable, nor are they natural, nor necessarily ideal. The book does this in two ways. One is by internationalizing the problem, by showing what other democracies are doing in response to their journalism crises. Rod Benson and Craig Aaron, who you will hear from later, both do a great job of showing this by showing how the U.S. is unique among democracies for how little it spends on its public media system. Rod Benson also debunks many of the myths associated with a government-supported press, like the idea that it leads to less journalistic independence or a totalitarian society. His research actually shows the exact opposite happening. In addition to internationalizing the problem, if we historicize the debate, place this crisis in its historical context, and see it as a culmination of longer historical processes, we can see that the internet did not simply break the news a few years ago. It's been in a slow decline for decades. One could even argue that there were structural vulnerabilities built into the commercial system's original design. History also shows us that the U.S. government has always supported news media. The historian Richard John has uncovered a tradition of large postal subsidies for newspaper distribution, and others have expanded on this scholarship, including Jeff Cowan and David Westphal in the chapter they wrote in our book. And even less known are the roads not taken when the government nearly intervened to permanently create a less market-dependent media system. My chapter in the book focuses on one of these critical junctures in the post-war 40s, which saw the brief ascendance of what might be referred to as a social democratic approach to media. And in response to a crisis with some similarities to the one we're facing today, progressive policymakers sought to lessen profit pressures on key parts of the media system. For example, they called for experiments in non-profit print media and more of a public interest model for broadcast media. So to give one example of that, if broadcasters didn't adhere to strict public interest mandates, they would trigger a public discussion and likely termination of their broadcast license. That's course, inconceivable today. Although Commissioner Michael Copps, who spoke here just last week, many of these issues has often tried to reinsert some of these ideals back into the media policy process. But these initiatives in the 40s ultimately either were watered down or suppressed by red baiting and other pressures. In some cases, the result of an industry backlash. In other cases, then as now, the result of liberal policymakers made nervous by their own conclusions and fearful of sounding too radical. Indeed, there are a number of parallels we could draw between the recent FCC report on the future of media, at least with regard to its policy prescriptions not being in sync with its underlying media critique. So these outcomes, especially in the 40s, although arguably from today as well, reflect a media industry consensus, not necessarily the broader public's. These were not inevitable outcomes. A more affirmative role for governmental regulation was possible then and remains so today. So I think the conclusions that Bob and I draw from a lot of this research can be condensed into 5 points. I don't want to pretend that all the contributors would agree with these 5 points, but they go as follows. First, journalism produces a public good that's essential to democracy. Second, the advertising model that has subsidized journalism for the past 125 years is no longer viable. Third, neither new commercial nor nonprofit models are replacing the journalism being lost in traditional media. Fourth, given what could be seen as a market failure, policy interventions are needed to establish public service journalism. And finally, international models as well as US history suggest a legitimate governmental role for supporting the press. So that's an overview of our book. I hope it wasn't too pessimistic. If you're looking for some light beach reading material, this makes for a nice gift for yourself or a friend or family member. On that note, I'm eager to turn it back to Tom and the panelists. Thank you. Oh, I sit here. Okay. Yes. All right. I was going to skip. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor. And I'd like to invite the panelists to all come to the stage and take their places. Thank you, Victor, for that informative introduction. This book has many chapters, and we can only have a stage of a certain size, so I will rely on the authors present to represent their views and Victor to represent the other 26. So first, Tom Frank, I'll turn to you with a question, if you don't mind, suddenly. That's it, it works. Thank you. Steve Alban, the principal author of the FCC report, talked of the hamsterization of journalism. In your chapter, you mentioned the bright, frenetic mills. Can you describe, I think you probably have some rich description of one particular mill that you are familiar with, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on how that's working out in your view.
The title is, you know, the British national anthem, whatever it is, Dark Satanic Mills, but instead they're all wonderful and bright and frenetic with activity. And the mills in question are what are referred to as content mills. Y'all know what this is. It's, you know, there's a couple of different companies. In fact, there's probably dozens of them by now that have figured out that you can a way to produce journalism that's really inexpensive. And the way you do that is by hiring people via the internet to write about. You have hundreds of topics out there that you're looking for stories on, and they turn in whatever 300 words or something like that. And they what makes it really wonderful is that they pay these writers very little. I've got the amount somewhere in my Harper story. What is it? 15 cents? No, it's not. That would be really generous. That would be dark and satanic if they paid them that much. They get $15 per story. Okay, and the copy editors This is at a company called Demand Media. That was on average, people got $15 per story, and this story is 300 words long. And the copy editors there get $2.50 for each story that they correct. So the idea is you have to do a whole bunch of these in a day or something, or a week or whatever, in order to make a living at this. But you know, people insist it can be done. You can earn a living this way. You just have to crank out lots and lots of stories. What really intrigued me about the content mills is the way that they choose what stories to assign to people. They do it with a computer program that that looks at what people are searching for on Google and then assigns stories on that basis. Well, they combine it with another factor, which is what would an advertiser pay to associate themselves with a given topic. So some things are going to turn out to be more desirable than other things, and so I guess I assume that some topics, you know, advertiser wouldn't want to have anything to do with at all, and so those things just don't get written about. But and there's your future for you, God damn it. But the that's what makes it, you know, so wonderful. And these companies, you know, I don't think any of them are publicly traded yet. Am I right about that? There's been some activity. One of them was sold to another company, so presumably they have some value. Presumably it's a model that can work. The thing is, does it work for the public? Who does it work for? And I was intrigued by the cover when I was writing this story. Columbia Journalism Review was working along similar lines. They had this great image on their cover of a hamster in one of those endless wheel things. You know, hamsters love to run on those things, and that's the future of journalism, they said. You know, that's all of us on the hamster wheel. And so I thought about that image that really struck me. And it's like, who benefits from these? You know, who wins when journalism is practiced along the model of the content mills? And the answer is, it's the guy that owns the hamster farm, right? That's the only winner. I have another idea too, but we'll come to the other idea later.
With that, before we get too optimistic.
Yeah, where's my $15? That was 300 words.
See me later. Nikki, you're coming at this from a different perspective, and the concept of citizen journalism, and your chapter explores the way citizen journalists have been perceived, and you have a perspective and I'd say a more expansive vision in the future. And perhaps you can explain a little bit about citizen journalism and the future of, I suppose, folks who are going to get paid $0 in contributing, and why that may or may not work.
Sure. So how many people in this room actually know what citizen journalism means? Okay. Well, we've got a very special crowd here. So when I ask my friends who don't care what I do all the time, they don't know what citizen journalism means. So to get us all on the same page, I like to think of citizen journalists as people who commit random, everyday acts of journalism, sometimes without knowing it. But this has existed for a really long time. If you think of, I think the V-Day photo might have been taken by just a random person. It's, if you think of great moments in history that have just been caught on a snap of a photo and handed to a newspaper. It's been letters to the editor. So citizen journalists have been very active in what they've given to newspapers, advice columns, etc. So citizen journalists have been around for a long time. Now the real question becomes, okay, there's been a decline, as Victor's talked about, in traditional news media. So what can we do to get some new news out there? And one thing people are looking towards is people like you and people like your neighbors to get some new content out. But the problem I have with this is a lot of the time the kind of content that people want citizens like you to be producing is very much like the kind of content that you see in your newspapers and on TV. And I think a lot of us have problems with the kind of news content that we see in newspapers and TV. So I'd like to think about citizen journalism as a little bit more expansive, and to think about some of the things that journalism could be that it isn't right now.
Great, thanks, Nikki. And I'll turn now to Jessica with a question about her chapter. You have an analysis of the context of where we are, about how journalists must operate in a networked environment. Slightly different from Yochai Benkler's chapter. And perhaps you can talk to us a little around that background, because I think it's we've seen the demand media future. Nikki's offered citizens as a partial gap filler there, but tell us more about the context as you see it, because I think that's very useful.
So the chapter from the book is an excerpt from a book that I wrote with Tracy Van Slyke, Beyond the Echo Chamber: Reshaping Politics Through Network Progressive Media, available at your local independent bookstore. And we wrote it about the news cycle from 04 to 08, looking at how money was flowing into the progressive arena around journalism, around media, to try to really jumpstart innovation and new ways of operating and to fund some citizen journalism and some interactive and data-driven journalism projects, and use them as part of larger strategic campaigns. So part of what we look at and what we encourage journalists to do in the book has become truisms at this point. Part of what we look at and what we encourage journalism to do has been debunked by this point, which is kind of the horrible pleasure of writing about the current events. It's a complicated debate that's happening around what is the compact between journalists and their users, and how should these users be positioned as citizens, as cheap labor, as ambassadors, as activists. And it's kind of it depends on what you're trying to do with your journalism, which is a point that's often missed. There's a kind of a monolithic definition of what journalism is and how it should operate. So in the book, we would take a look at the ways in which not just individuals and journalists are interacting, but how how networks are being activated, networks of activists, networks of organizations, networks of other institutions, and how hybrid forms of journalism are emerging as a result. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, it does. And I'll turn now to Victor before I come to Craig. This idea that Jessica's brought up around not people who read journalism as an audience, but as playing a range of roles. I'm just sort of intrigued. That seems, you're a media historian. We're in my view, we're in a somewhat of a different age where we can think of engaging with an audience in new ways. And I just wonder if you can shed any light from any of the other chapters, or any perspective you have as a media historian around this question of the role the audience can play, and whether there's some limits to that. I mean, there always was historically, but...
Sure, absolutely. I mean, there's always been potential for the audience to be more of a media producer than just a media consumer. A lot of times people assume this is something that was invented with the internet, but there is a very long tradition of that. And to bring it back to the area that I've done research on especially the 1940s, the post-war 40s, at that point it was generally understood, I think, that as much there wasn't this dichotomy of people who were creating their own media and then media policies from up above. That many, at least media reformers, saw that these areas were very much linked, and that to focus on media policy reform was also enabling new ways that the audience could create new media. So there was a very vibrant media reform movement in the 40s that was short-lived, largely because of red baiting and other political shifts. But I think you can draw a lot of parallels between what's happening then and now. And one of the benefits of doing that is that it sort of it breaks through this ahistorical amnesia that we keep thinking that with the internet that's changed everything and everything's new, and that's why I think it's always good to bring some history back.
Great, thanks. And Craig, now you're the leader of an organization that's obtained, I think, millions of signatures in favor of public service media within the last 6 months around the budget battles that have gone on here in DC to continue the funding at a stationary level. Public media to the rescue. How realistic is that?
Well, I think it's more realistic than we allow ourselves to believe. I think that there's sort of this thing that happens here in Washington where limits are really put on what's possible that are detached from what people actually want and need. It was interesting. This isn't in my chapter, but because I discovered it after turning it in, which is hard to believe considering how late I turned my chapter in. But there was a survey done of people asking them, well, how much of the federal budget do you think goes to support public broadcasting? It's under attack. The Republicans in the House want to gut it. And people's answer was 5%. 5% of the federal budget. Now, of course, it's actually only $400 million a year. Essentially, if you divide that by taxpayers, that works out to, $1.25 or so. But yet people thought it was 5%, and even more so, they thought that was okay. They thought that was a good idea. They supported funding. So here we are in Washington having a political debate where people are fighting over table scraps, and yet the actual audience out there, the actual voters out there, have no problem with us spending arguably hundreds of millions or billions of dollars more. That's just never the way it's been presented to them. They're not aware that while we're spending that, $1.25, $1.37, whatever it is now, that in England it's $80. In the Scandinavian countries, it's $100 per capita. Even in Canada, it's $22 per capita that we could spend. So, when you begin to think, well, what if we spent $5 per capita here? What might that look like? I think that's a more interesting conversation, and I think it's one that we need to have. And unfortunately, often it's been one that the public media institutions themselves have been afraid to have. They've bought into this idea that there's this incredible scarcity and that they shouldn't ask for more. And, every time a Republican member of Congress sneezes at them, they have to fire somebody. This has been their approach to this problem, but I think there's a better approach, and one where we actually step back and look at the important role that journalism plays in our society. We ask ourselves, how are we going to fill in these gaps, these huge gaps that Victor described? And in looking at all the policies, I think there's some really interesting things we can do around the edges and tax policy changes. But when it comes down to it, what we really need is a lot more money and the political will to say our money should go toward supporting this social good, which is journalism. And I think there is actually a surprising amount of energy out there for it. Our group, along with a few allies, took 1 million petition signatures in support of maintaining public media funding. The public media institutions themselves probably put in that many or more. Look at all the people who give support or are part of this fan culture around public media. We're talking about millions and millions of people who are potentially a political force, and yet all we ask them to do is, give it pledge time and get your tote bag, and then when we're really in trouble, help us defend this tiny, tiny slice of the pie. I think there's a far more interesting discussion to be had. Is like, well, what if we actually put these people, these fans, to work building that more robust public media system, and one that goes beyond just PBS and NPR into the broader universe that includes community radio and interesting online nonprofit experiments and many of the things the other panelists are talking about. I think that opportunity is staring us in the face, and yet we've let ourselves believe that all we can do is fight over this tiny little bit of pocket change.
Thanks, Greg. I'm feeling optimistic.
Optimism. Hamsters of the world unite.
Yeah, that might be the takeaway line. But because we got a little optimism, perhaps I'll go back to Tom Frank. You, in your chapter, basically, there's a critique of commercial media in the modern age. Do you see any hope at all? And if there, or are we left with...
You come to the wrong guy. I don't deal in hope. Come on now. It's like bitterness, cynicism, alienation, anger, that sort of thing. That's me, man.
I was just trying. You also...
Delivered with a smile,
I'm a little
of course.
Cautious in doing this, knowing we have a communications dean in the audience, school dean in the audience, but you have some tough words for journalism school deans. We've been doing some research about journalism institutions being producers of news here. Do you see any hope there, modeling behavior for others?
Journalism schools. I didn't go to a journalism school. I went to a history school. Okay, and that was a discipline that fell apart even before journalism did. So I went from when that was, they were cranking out historians like mad, and this is in the 1990s, and people with PhDs in English, there were even more of them, And we all went out onto the job market, and it was. I mean, there should have been something like content mills for us. I mean, there is. It's adjunct teaching, right? And that's what all of my friends were doing. And to this day, a lot of them still can't get tenured track jobs, and we're in our 40s now. And I looked at this situation, and I could make more money writing for the alternative news weekly in Chicago. So I did, and that was the end of academia. And you want to know, what did you say? Any optimism? No, I've thought about this, and the models for the future, right? Is the model the content mill? That's one system that it works anyways, right? And then people get paid. But look, let me take a step back. The reason I wrote about this stuff is because my sort of throughout my career, I've just had this, I've been documenting the way market populism, which is this term that I made up for, the faith that we have in markets, and that we think markets are going to speak with our voice, and markets are going to be perfectly democratic, and they're going to deliver these wondrous results. The way that this sort of all-American dogma fails and fails and fails and fails and fails. And what you're saying in journalism is the most spectacular failure, well, since 2008, since the financial crisis, I suppose. But it's just one after another. What model, if the professional model, and what we're seeing the demise of is the professional model of journalism, what model is going to take its place? Is it, all of us as, hamsters getting paid, $15 per story, or is it the public subsidy model? And I the first time I heard about the public subsidy model, I thought that was the greatest idea ever. And I know that that's how it works in Scandinavia, where the newspapers are heavily subsidized in all kinds of ways. And that just seemed so awesome to me until I thought about the world that we live in, where you basically have one of our two political parties in this country they would smash that. They would destroy it in a matter of minutes. I mean, they're talking about fucking with the debt ceiling just to send the economy into the tailspin that they think it should be in, so that all their gold will be valuable or something like that, Okay, that's my joke. What will succeed? You know what I've been reading lately, and it's alternately horrifying and yet sort of clairvoyant. A biography of William Randolph Hearst. You guys remember this guy? I mean, this was the guy, right? Citizen Kane. And his model of journalism is, first get yourself a gold mine, right? And be born into a really, really, really wealthy family, and then buy up all these very quality writers and sort of pursue your idiosyncratic political vision, which by the way, when he started out, he was pretty much on the left. He got a war going all on his own, amazing man, and then moved way to the right. And in the 1930s, launched these bizarre red hunting sprees and witch hunts and this kind of stuff. Fascinating man, but that model is going to survive. That model is going to thrive. In fact, that model, that's the Fox News sort of model. In fact, there's all kinds of ways in which they take pages from the biography of William Randolph Hearst, and you see them doing this all the time. I had another model that I thought would work. No.
So
sorry.
I think to keep our spirits up, Tom. Thank you, Craig. We had Commissioner Copps here last week, and he spoke about the role of the FCC. And in prior decades, the FCC played in some ways, a regulator from afar role of the public interest obligations. And these have, in a way, lapsed. And I want, perhaps if you could talk, bring some context to the audience about where we are right now, and perhaps talk about what you said in the book, but also about the FCC report that was released, because I think there's something interesting to be said there about perhaps getting demand media to do more than it has.
Well, the interesting thing for me about the FCC report was that it really did this amazing job chronicling the problem, and in some ways was sort of the capstone, the big phone book on top of this debate we've been having. Victor used the term classic pieces from 2008 and 2009, and only in the world of demand media can those already be classics. But here we are, and the FCC report did a great job of describing the problem, and then when it got, and I think Commissioner Copps has been very vocal about this to his credit, when it got to actually talking about, well, what can we do about it, they just kind of threw up their hands, and it sort of has become this thing where, well, we can't. I was joking earlier with a colleague that we can't really do anything about it. Might be the Obama doctrine, and I think that has sort of infected the FCC in a way that they seem very unwilling to use the powers they have, powers to say, you know what, you're using the public airwaves for free. That comes with some responsibilities. That's been completely watered down. Even the fact where getting a call from the FCC used to scare a local broadcaster, used to at least make them a little bit nervous. As this report chronicles, they haven't taken away a license in something like 30 years. Eventually, that toothless watchdog doesn't scare you anymore. And I think the failure in some ways of the current FCC has been in not reclaiming that role. I think they had a real opportunity. I think this crisis was an opportunity to take something like this Future of Media report and say, we really do have a problem here. Let's do something different. Here are some innovative policies. Here are some things we can do. And instead, they kind of threw up their hands. And I think that it's sort of our responsibility to say, that's not good enough, and that we need to get beyond. I mean, God bless the panel discussion. Believe me, where would I be without it? But we have to at some point get beyond that and actually go out and engage with the public. And there's been a lot of discussion about maybe doing that at some point. I think we're at that point where if we don't engage local communities, where we don't engage the community journalists in this question, we're not going to get anywhere, and we are going to be left with William Randolph Hearst model or the Fox News model. That's going to be the only alternative. I don't think we're there yet. I haven't given up hope. I think there's a lot of opportunity, and I see a lot of energy, but it's going to take a different attitude, and it's going to take a different attitude from journalists themselves. I mean, you were asking about journalism school. I actually did go to journalism school, and they very unsuccessfully beat out all these opinions that didn't quite work with me, but it worked with a lot of others who they were told, you can't be involved in politics, you probably shouldn't even vote if you're a journalist, and because of very good reasons for being objective or fair. I don't really believe in objectivity, but being fair in your reporting. But of course, the bosses never played by those rules. The bosses have spent the last 30 years at the FCC, consolidating and concentrating and becoming so big that when they toppled over, they really took the rest of us with them. And I think, though, that again, out of crisis comes opportunity, and we are at one of those moments of opportunity. But it's going to be a fleeting moment. So if we don't, activate now, if we don't get out there and actually engage the public in this discussion, begin to reintroduce them to these crazy ideas contained in this wonderful book, we really won't stand a chance.
So before we engage the public in the room and online, I'm going to have a last couple of questions to Nikki and Jessica. You're sort of working more at the media coalface or familiar with the community journalism. What promising models do you see out there, or behaviors do you see that of change within the journalism profession or the community within community media? Whichever. Jessica first.
Part of what we're seeing is a sort of a deconstruction of journalism, so the different functions that the journalist serves are being taken on by members of the public or by these sort of compacts between users and makers. So through fact-checking, combing through databases, trying to not just go out and find the news story, but to cull together collections of data and pictures and anecdotes that tell a larger story. So I think that learning to work in this way, it both democratizes the news gathering process, and it helps to fill in some of the gaps if you don't have a millionaire in your back pocket. And I think Tom and I were actually at the University of Chicago at the same time, and while he was trying to make something out of this discipline that was sort of crumbling, I was trying to make up my own discipline. I was in a multidisciplinary master's degree program, and so I think I have a certain faith in innovation and bricolage and in piecing together the old and the new. And I'm seeing a lot of that, and it's really encouraging, and it's also part of the deeper history of what we now think of as this monolithic public broadcasting was actually just a bunch of little amateurs, a bunch of small educational stations, a bunch of people trying to do something good for the public that got rolled up into a larger entity. And that same thing needs to happen now. We need to be taking a critical look, and sometimes a very critical look, at what these new technologies can do for journalism, and rewarding the behaviors that represent real innovation in this space.
Interesting. So rolling up the community media, you sound like the William Randolph Hearst of
Consolidation, that's what I'm here to argue.
Nikki.
So one of the points I really want to make is that it's really important that we don't patronize the public and say that the public needs to be told about how important news and information is. And that we think about journalism not just as journalism, but as news and information, as the Knight Commission report has put out there. And what that means is not to ask citizens to be replacements or to serve as models for good journalism, or to look for them to be journalists maybe standing in guard for what's missing in public media, but to see people as acting as civic actors and seeing journalism as part of what they do each and every day. And I think that it's really important to recognize that people do want news. And people don't need to be told that they want news. And people are already chronicling every part of their day and already chronicling what they see in their towns and in their communities. If you look at Facebook feeds, you see local news all around you. It's not defined as local news, but it's, hey, my park down the street has some graffiti in it. That's local news. We don't call it as such, right? So I think it's really important to take on a much more expansive notion of what it means to have the public involved, and to not necessarily be so concerned that what the public is giving back doesn't quite resemble the journalism we'd like it to be replacing or to supplement.
Great, thanks. And just check on the mic. Is the mic here for the questions? So we'll have to wait for the mic because the mic isn't here.
We can hear people.
But it's the audience. Here we are. The mic is here. Great. So we'll take some questions from the gentleman in the. Please stand up.
Yeah, I'm fine. Thanks. Couple of fast comment questions. I've been a journalist for about 50 years in the print area, and I'd like to address briefly what this lady just said about citizen journalism. I think that verges into the wonders of blogging, which I look on with a very jaundiced eye, at least when it comes to anything like a replacement for traditional journalism. But secondly, what she is suggesting might work with local news, but how is that going to possibly work with national and international news that requires people who have access, training, funding? What's the citizen journalist going to do about that? I suggest it's going to be nothing. The second point is addressed to the gentleman who was talking about whipping the public up in behalf of public broadcasting. I think that's a great idea, but what if anything, does that do for the print media? As Frank said, I don't think there's any chance at all that Congress, or at least one party in Congress, would for a moment appropriate any money for print media subsidy.
Thank you, sir. And Nikki, if you can please take a swipe at that question, but I know there's a chapter by Sean Powers in the book as well that looks at international coverage. So.
Right. Well, I think that nobody out there is arguing that you or me are going to somehow suddenly become the next White House correspondent. I think that's folly, right? But the question is whether we can supplement some of the news organizations that are on the decline the most are local news organizations, right? So if communities can have people who are in their communities covering news, I think that's a great thing. But it's really important to remember how much we can ask people to do. So it's more about encouraging a sort of journalism as a civic act than it is about encouraging a particular type of journalism. And that's kind of the difference I'd like to make. But in no way am I suggesting that citizen journalists should be replacements. I think that many of the things that we're talking about today are ways that we can sustain and provide alternatives for funding to make sure that the good journalism that we care so much about continues to exist.
Great, thanks. And Victor, if you'd like to mention Sean Powers'
Sure. One of the more innovative policy proposals in the book comes from a professor from Georgia State University, Sean Powers, who, I don't know, this may have been part of his dissertation research, but he looked at the funding for international broadcasting, for example, the Voice of America, that the U.S. Puts out about almost $700 million a year towards that. And there's a law, the 1948 Smith-Mundt Act, which prevents any of that international broadcasting to air within the borders of the United States. And he's suggesting that perhaps that's an outdated law and we should look into that money, or at least look at ways where we could provide international coverage through those sources.
Great, thanks. And Craig, public service media for print.
Well, I think in terms of, the old broadsheet, that's probably not going to happen. But in terms of actually subsidizing and supporting reporters, I think that's a very good idea. I think that's absolutely what we need to be doing, and they will probably be multimedia. And in terms of print journalism, I think, of course, increasingly we're talking about online journalism, but we're still talking about the written word, and that's absolutely what we do need to be supporting and subsidizing. In terms of the political environment, I'm not blind to, who's in charge of certain agencies and houses, parts of Congress right now, but I also saw that when we saw this incredible response to the attempts to cut public broadcasting funding, all of a sudden there were 6 or 7 senators sending me requests for money because of their great support for public media. So I think that there is if we can demonstrate the broad public support, if we can organize that, then those political realities can change. And I think that's increasingly part of the conversation we need to be having is how do we mobilize people? I think citizen journalism has a role. I think the answer is both. We need to support those professional journalists who can go sit at the city council meeting, and their work is going to be supplemented by things that are happening in the community. And increasingly, with a lot of Jessica's talking about, they're going to be talking to each other. But from a policy perspective, if we don't start to do that, good old-fashioned organizing work, if we don't start to accept that politics is going to be part of the solution to this media crisis, then we really don't stand a chance at all. That's the best chance that I've found so far.
Next question. I can't see the mic. The gentleman at the back. Yes, just there. Okay.
Gareth Porter, Interpress Service. Just piggybacking on the last comment here, that politics is part of the solution. I'd like to suggest that politics is all the solution, and that, I want to challenge the panel to deal with the question of whether this whole idea of, getting more money for public television, public radio, isn't really kind of skipping over, stages of development. The model that was suggested, the closest thing to a good model of what we'd like to see was from the 1940s. We all know that there have been a few generations of change in the wrong direction for obvious, well, maybe not obvious, but very fundamental reasons in this country. And so what I want to argue for you to respond to is that what we're dealing with in this country is, fundamental social and economic changes, which translate into political changes, that really transcend sort of, putting forward the idea of more money for, subsidizing journalism as a solution. We need something, we need to start organizing to deal with the political issues before we go to this kind of solution, is my suggestion.
Any thoughts, Victor?
I'll just start out with a few general reactions to what I think is a very provocative, very true comment that the gentleman just made, which is this idea that we will need a transformation in our political culture in many ways before we can really get to some of these solutions that we're calling for. I mean, when I started out my talk earlier saying that in 2009 there was this kind of optimism, we thought that was a window of opportunity where there could be this kind of paradigm shift. This was a critical juncture. I don't want to say the window is totally closed, but it has been ironic that at a moment where we see market failure all around us, what we often hear the most is from the Tea Party movement calling for even less government intervention in public policy. So I think the first step will probably be at least liberal policymakers to stop buying into the logic that the government has no legitimate role in trying to address this crisis in journalism.
Okay. Craig.
I mean, we also have sort of a chicken and egg problem here, because I think that in order to bring about that political change you're talking about, of course, we need to reform the media, because they have such an incredible role to play in, shaping those perceptions and what we're going to do. So I don't think there's any question we need to tackle both problems, but I guess I ultimately believe that, there may be some, relatively simple things and relatively inexpensive things in the, millions and billions that we could do that might help bring about that shift. I don't think there's any question that it's an uphill climb. On the other hand, I think we're living in a really tumultuous political moment, and we could find ourselves in a couple of years, maybe we are still talking about the Tea Party, maybe we're talking about something else that comes next, and we should at the very least be ready to seize on those opportunities. I mean, for example, with public media, we passed an almost $1 trillion stimulus package, the American Recovery Act, and the public media institutions had nothing in there. They didn't even ask. They didn't have a package together to say, hey, the government's about to put in trillions of dollars to stimulate the economy. Why aren't journalism jobs just as important as jobs building roads? But they had nothing together, nothing to even put in there, and that was a real missed opportunity. I hope that by the next time they won't make that mistake. Well, yeah, maybe they said they didn't want it.
The gentleman in the black shirt on the back, no, right at the back of the room, J.U. No, at the back of the room. The tall gentleman.
When Commissioner Cox was here, I came, and I'm so glad that this panel follows on it, because I also think that the media is hugely important for all kinds of reasons I won't bore you with, and I'm glad that this institution alone in the space of 1 week has done 2 panels on this. And I agree with the thrust of the discussion that public investment in the media has all kinds of uses, and that's where we should look. Given that everyone is saying that, I want to point out one thing that I don't think should be forgotten. I think if the people are going to be asked to invest in the media, there are some flaws in how the media has performed until now that should be looked at. It might even be a way of mobilizing more support. My own work is U.S. foreign policy, and I'm dismayed at how the media covers what the United States does outside the U.S. Last week when I was here, I mentioned the New York Times. One line they wrote there about Hillary Clinton in Addis Ababa was just, I thought, horrible. Sunday, 60 Minutes repeated the same mistake, where basically it's not telling the American people some of the things that the U.S. government is doing wrong outside, so the people are not well informed about it. So my point is, I do agree with the thrust, but if we are going to be asked to invest in the media, and I think we should, the media should also find ways of correcting some of its flaws. And one of the biggest is long-term U.S. support of dictators. I'm from Africa, so that is very important to me, that the American people have no clue about how much the U.S. government props up dictators in Africa.
Thank you, sir. So questions of governance in media, and I think of this both in terms of, if we're as pessimistic about commercial media as Tom Frank is, and I share some of his pessimism, then we're left with community media, which hasn't had the greatest reputation in the past, and public media has been, let's face it, embroiled in some critiques earlier this year. And I wonder if this doesn't bring up a broader question of governance that Nikki or Jessica or Craig would like to address.
Well, I think one thing should be clear. I don't think that everybody on the panel should be assumed to be well, I very much do believe in public media. I don't think that everyone on the panel should necessarily be construed as supporting broad public investment for all sectors of public media or of media, because I certainly don't think that I should be giving subsidies to the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, as much as I love them very much. But I think there's a really important question about media literacy here, right? And it's how can we make sure that the public, in a time when the media is increasingly fragmented and increasingly confusing, and there's more and more and more of it, and your attention is limited to even less, people, as we learned from an FCC report that came out this past week, people spend 9 minutes per month reading local news, right? So what can we do to make sure that those 9 minutes are the best 9 minutes that they can spend reading local news, right? So how can we make people the smartest news readers that we can, right? And so there are definitely problems with the media, and that's what the role of academics and the role of public policy folks are, to point out and to hold the media accountable for some of those things, right? But I think it's very important to realize that, you know, part of what we're going to see in terms of this dark and scary future is not necessarily a future of public support, but perhaps a future where there are bigger media institutions and then a lot of smaller media institutions that are much smaller than they once were. So I just wanted to recalibrate that a little bit.
Okay. Anything, Craig, on Jessica? Craig?
Go ahead on governance.
Well, in governance, I mean, you know, I think obviously if we're going to seriously talk about reinvesting in public media, we have to address who's handing out the money and who's getting the money, for sure. And I think that starts by removing the public media system, or this more robust public media system, from the annual appropriations process. And you know, leaving, I think one of our big problems is that our public media is at the mercy of the political whims of Washington. And I think you know, a better strategy would be proactive policies that would create a public trust, something that would really fund public media for the long term, avoid the cyclical nature of funding, where depending on which party's in charge, you know, how much are they being hammered or not hammered, as the case may be. I don't think that's the way to do it for the long run, and I think that's a governance problem. I think ultimately that probably also includes changing the way we appoint some of these people, where maybe the president shouldn't be picking all the members of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And, you know, I think we need to look at some reforms there, and also how the money is spread out. There's a lot of turfiness in the field. I think, you know, obviously bringing more money in might help some of that, but we do have to look at these institutions, how they relate to each other. That's probably a whole nother discussion, but I think we have to really have to look at governance, because if you're asking the American people, as I would like to do, to invest a lot more of their tax dollars in the media, they need to have good reason to believe that might actually be spent more responsibly.
Okay, thanks, Free. And I'll just, before I take another question, just mention a suggestion that Steve Waldman made in his report last week of directing advertising dollars that the US government spent, which is around $1 billion a year by his calculation, at more actively directing it towards areas of media where journalism is most likely to be created. And he was thinking about local journalism. So $1 billion isn't nothing. It's a lot more than the $15 from Demand Media. And I just wonder if anyone has anything to say on that on the panel. But I will take other questions. Please, if we're coming to the end of the Q&A section, so please, if you're going to raise a question. The lady at the back, J.U., yes, great. Thank you.
Hi there. My name is Susie Kim. I'm a reporter from Mother Jones Magazine here in D.C. My question, you know, there's been a lot of discussion about the politics of funding the media. I wanted to kind of turn the focus to the politics of the media. I think one of the most interesting developments, at least here in terms of Washington political journalism, is the fact that, you know, there's been a big rise in you know, organizations, media outlets that either lean left or lean right, and they aren't just producing commentary and, you know, what's traditionally considered blogging, but original reporting. A lot of what, you know, even folks like the New York Times and the Post end up following the lead of some of these organizations. You have the Daily Caller, the Huffington Post, all these folks producing original reporting online. You know, but at the same time, you know, I think along with this development of the politicization of media is one, you know, you have a lot of increasing public, you know, distrust in media in terms of on the left, on the right, on where this news is coming from, and even if it is based on original, solid reporting, you know, I mean, they recognize they come from outlets with a particular bias, and sensationalism. I mean, this sort of, I think, overlaps with the fact that politics are involved and the stakes are political, and you have a lot of complaints from both sides about that. I mean, so I guess my question is, what is the place for disinterestedness? I guess that's a better term maybe than objectivity, but in media, and who should be promoting that? Is this a value that someone, an institution, whether it's publicly funded or not, should be trying to sustain in the midst of, you know, all of these developments in news?
Great. Tom, you're No,
I'm not
journalist.
going to answer that because I've never done disinterested journalism. I've always been a columnist or an opinion guy. But I actually have a question after these guys answer that. Then I have another question for them. We're really going to get them this time.
Okay. Okay. Any Jessica?
I've studied both the sort of centrist, disinterested media and partisan media, and so I'd say that ideally you would have a set of people who are trying to establish some common facts and establish the range of opinion. And often inside the Beltway, that range is not characterized broadly enough for people, which is part of the reason there's been a growth in partisan media. And then, obviously, everyone's going to argue from their interests, whether those are corporate interests or political interests. And so this enters into a larger question of moving from objectivity to transparency, and the media literacy question that Nikki brought up. How can we understand how the different ways in which news is used as a tool and is characterized? How can we make that more transparent on the face of it? And how can we use the monies that go into federally funded public broadcasting as a tool for developing those standards and ethics more explicitly, and then trying to hold some of these other outlets accountable? We saw Vivian Schiller moving from NPR to NBC. NBC recognized, here's a smart woman, she's innovative, she's forward-thinking. They snapped her up. And she was able to go there because she wasn't held under the same scrutiny in that commercial space as she has been over the last year in the public space. And I'd like to see equal standards being applied across the board, and even as Michael argues in his chapter, to some of the fake news that's really serving as a primary news source for younger users.
Thomas, you told me you had to say the other.
My question is, where are the unions in all this? The voice of professionalism. What's happened to them while in this massive decline has been going on?
In a word, decimated, I think. I think that a lot of them are losing. A lot of union jobs are gone. I think Craig can speak to this as well. But I don't think they've been silent on these issues at all.
Do they have ideas? Do they have suggestions?
Well, there definitely have been attempts to create worker-owned newspapers, and some have been successful. There have been other business models that have been attempted where sometimes the union members are actually exploited in the deal, like with the Tribune. So there are other. I don't think they've been absent. I think they've been engaged, but they're.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think the Newspaper Guild has been very outspoken in particular, while of course being decimated. I think the unity groups, National Association of Hispanic Journalists, National Association of Black Journalists, have actually been far out front and often challenging, frankly, companies that they've been relying on for their survival as organizations, which has put them in some interesting positions. That said, in terms of truly mobilizing all of the journalists, there's a long way to go, and I think that knee-jerk skepticism of not just government involvement, but even politics in the newsroom presents a big challenge. And very often, working journalists have really been the last ones to speak up in their own defense. So even as all the desks were clearing out around them, they kept thinking, no, I'm here to be a journalist. I'm just here to cover it. I shouldn't say anything. Now, again, those rules do not apply to their bosses. They're happy to come here and lobby and push for certain kinds of policies. And eventually, they were looking around, and there was just a handful of them left.
Having done some research in this area, I can actually tell you that journalists who are often union members, but a lot of journalists who are in these situations where they see their newsrooms emptying out around them are often the least likely to innovate. And that's something to really remember as we think about this. When we think about journalism in crisis, there's often a fear and panic that goes through the hearts and minds of journalists, and they tend to think backwards instead of thinking forwards. And what we need to be able to do is to be able to face this crisis on its head and to encourage innovation. And so instead of worrying about clinging for jobs and clinging for circulation and clinging for readers, we need to be thinking about how to move forward.
Yeah, thank you. And we're getting to the end, so I'll take just a couple more questions. And this gentleman on the right in the light jacket. Could be
Al Milliken, AM Media. What more have any of you written and or spoken about the self-anointed media watchdog bloggers and filmmakers and social media users who have been monitoring and correcting so-called mainstream, well-paid, and still influential network broadcast and print media, who have made some very serious mistakes in recent years. All over today, all over Christian media that I follow very closely, I have noticed an uproar about NBC coverage of the U.S. Open, the National Golf Championship yesterday, that edited out a reference to God, I believe in the Pledge of Allegiance. NBC, I heard, did issue an on-air apology yesterday, but that was not sufficient to the commentators I have been listening to.
Any background? Jessica, looking to...
I've written about it quite a bit. I mean, I think the dynamic holds no matter what your ideology is. There are many more ways to hold media accountable, and there are many more opportunities to create responses from people that you don't agree with. I think that that is a signature of this moment, and it's about free speech. I don't know how else to answer your question.
I will just respond a little bit about the fact-checking movement, because I think it's a very interesting sort of disaggregated unit of journalism that is emerging, and the role it will play is, I think, a very open question, and whether it will succeed or just become another aspect of he said, she said. But I think that's an interesting point you make. Final question, if we have anyone from... Yep, the gentleman at the back in the white shirt.
Thanks. Very quickly, if we're ever going to move this beyond the think tanks and academic circles, I think everybody in journalism that thinks this is an important issue has to put some skin in the game. Has there ever been any talk about a month-long strike, or where all journalists who want to participate put their pens down, put their cameras down? Of course, like any unionist will tell you, not everyone's going to agree to participate in that. Maybe you get 40%. But the point is, you can try to address the issue, call some public attention to it, and everyone can spend a month. I prefer August, because Congress can do the least damage to us then, and we can all enjoy ourselves. But following the end of the period, everyone can have their articles ready, and we can draw the line in the sand, condemning those broadcasters, networks, and papers that didn't join the strike or didn't cover the strike. It's time to take some actions other than just talking to ourselves.
What would the strike
So
be against?
It would be a reminder to let everyone know that if we are doing anything important, some people might just notice its absence.
Great. So with that question about a strike in August, I'll ask the panelists to perhaps answer that question if they'd like, or provide some closing comments.
We saw the writers' union strike, and some of the things that came out of that: more online video for writers that were out of work and got to play around, and more reality television. I think it's a very dangerous proposition. And there's plenty of content for people to consume. So I would say that other means might work better.
Please, any thoughts?
I don't. What am I?
Have we made you more optimistic?
No, no. Oh my God. No. Well, it's my business, right? Disillusionment is my business. What was I going to say? The guy who asked about the bias critique. This is actually a really fascinating sort of aspect of our culture in the last 30 years. I used to run a magazine called The Baffler, and we had a great essay by a guy who should be here today but isn't. Chris Lehman. You know this guy, you guys know this guy. He traced the history of the media bias critique, where it was, and it was basically more or less invented by Spiro Agnew, for deliberately in 1969. And he was, I'm sorry, this was the history of the liberal media bias critique. Before that, the bias critique always went the other way, because you were talking about guys like William Randolph Hearst and Colonel McCormick in Chicago. These were very right-wing gents, right? And so the bias critique was always that these guys were doing the newspaper was always doing the bidding of big money or something like that. But Spiro Agnew deliberately flipped it on its head identifying, instead of the publisher, a guy like Colonel McCormick in Chicago, the real problem in journalism were the professionals. It was the problem is with professionalism. These people who have arrogated the power of the publisher to themselves in their little clique, clique of professional writers or whatever it is, and are making news decisions for the entire country. And what's funny is, as that has become less true over the years, now you have Fox News, you have talk, AM talk radio that's almost completely conservative with an exception here and there. As this has become a less and less valid description of the media environment we live in, it's now everywhere. The liberal media bias critique is everywhere now as it's become less true. It's a fascinating story.
Nikki, did you join a strike or some closing comments?
I'm going to defer to Jessica's comment on that, but I do want to say something about this idea of disinterestedness. And I think there's some really good stuff written by Jay Rosen and James Carey, two journalism scholars. And Jay Rosen, you can find him at presslink.org. And what Jay talks about is not so much creating a journalism of politics or a journalism of partisanship, but a journalism that really allows people to understand the issues that are going on. And I think that there is a place for partisan backbiting, right? Those are the things for the junkies. Those are the things. I just moved here from LA. People in LA don't read politics and talk about politics at parties. We just don't do that. But in DC, that's what people do, I find.
You arrived last week.
When you think about the kind of journalism that can really serve people and talk about journalism that would increase media literacy, you can think about journalism that actually explains things to people, that doesn't just start each day anew, for example. Or instead of having a he said, she said, actually think about whether the person you're quoting that's a skeptic on global warming is really worth quoting, right? So there are ways to change the discourse of journalism without necessarily hedging on this question, is it objective or is it not objective? And to just say one thing about your idea of where the liberal media bias critique began, there couldn't actually have been a liberal media bias critique until Spiro Agnew, because there was no professional class of journalists until about the 1960s. So it kind of, anyway, yeah. So thank you.
Thank you, Nikki.
Okay, well, I'm not quite ready to endorse the strike, but I am ready to advocate for organizing, and I think that that is going to be a key to turning the tide, is really engaging the public and engaging working journalists in these thorny political questions. And so if that means we have to live in a world where at parties we talk about the future of journalism, I'm willing to accept worse parties for this broader change. And I do think we do have a lot of public education to do for people to really think about the media and journalism as not just something that happens to them, but something that they actually can influence, either whether that's doing their own journalism or whether that's getting involved in these larger political questions. And I hope that if we can at least get to the point where those discussions are being had, we're a long way down the road.
Victor, you edited all the chapters. I'm sure you have some fine thoughts.
I'm intrigued by the idea of the strike, but I'll just leave it at that. The idea of partisanship or bias in media, there are a couple pieces in the book that deal directly with that. Chris Hedges savages the idea of objectivity. Laura McGann raises the important question, which I agree with. It's not so much about partisan journalism. I don't think we need to panic about that as much. It's more about these partisan hacks, like you may describe them as, James O'Keefe and Andrew Breitbart, who are not constrained by facts, and they are rushing into this void. Laura McGann talks about this a little bit in the book, but I want to end on just an optimistic note, which is, I think this idea about market failure and public subsidies, it's never so much about protecting the incumbents or just shoring up the status quo. It's about transforming the entire system. And I think once you do that structurally over time, a lot of these cultures will change. And if we could somehow confer the status to journalism that we give to libraries and public schools and Museums might not be the best analogy there, but I think you get the idea. I think that would be an honorable objective here. Now, I'll end on that note. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor, and thank you to all the panelists. I think it's been a fascinating and very vibrant discussion. As Victor and his co-editor, Bob McChesney, wrote, in short, just about everything rides on how this crisis in journalism plays out. I hope that you will continue to be engaged in these questions. And if you are interested in further in our work on these issues, please go to mediapolicy.newamerica.net. And if you have some time, please join us at the back of the room. We will have some wine and cheese, and there are copies of the book for sale. If you're lucky, I think you could snag at least six signatures. Thank you again to all the panelists. And if you'd like to put your hands together, and we'll take a break. Thank you all for coming.